Welcome, everyone. It's great to start our second day of the Data and Analytics Summit, and 3 for some of you from our pre-conferences on Monday. We're excited today for our presentation on making the invisible visible, the importance of the who and the how did we do in designing equitable supports. And I'll leave it off to Lori Flatt, our Director of Holistic Student Supports, to announce our presenters today.
Great, thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. My name is Lori Flatt, and I'm the Director of Holistic Student Supports at Achieving the Dream. It's my pleasure to introduce our next session entitled Using Evidence to Design Equitable Services and Supports. When centering equity in student success work, it's important to integrate data to identify where interventions are needed and to assess how interventions work. Achieving true equity means serving all students, including those in the smallest populations at our institutions. We are thrilled to have 3 speakers with us today who focus on Native American student populations, and we believe their critical work has the potential to impact equity on all of our campuses as we include data from our smallest populations to inform our designs for equity and success. It is my pleasure to introduce Shelley Lowe, who is the Executive Director of the Harvard University Native American Program and editor of the book, Beyond the Asterisk, Understanding Native Students in Higher Education. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jameson D. Lopez, who is an Assistant Professor in Education Policy Studies and Practice at the University of Arizona. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heather J. Schotten, who is the Director of Indigenous Education Initiatives and an Associate Professor and Department Chair in the College of Education at the University of Oklahoma, and also editor of Beyond the Asterisk, Understanding Native Students in Higher Education. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
You're muted.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm not sure why it's not working now. I'll jump in and to say good afternoon, good morning to some of you, depending on where you are. Good evening. It's a pleasure to join you all today and just have some great dialogue, hopefully, about issues of data and equity, particularly as we talk about Indigenous populations. So I'm very happy and honored to be with my colleagues here, Jameson and Shelley, and the work that we have engaged with for the last 15 plus years in terms of addressing issues of data and visibility for Indigenous students particularly. And so we wanted to give you just a really brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to start with unpacking data and visibility. What does that mean? Particularly, what does that mean for Indigenous populations? Why is that a problem? Why does it exist? And then Jameson's going to talk with us a little bit about unpacking Indigenous quantitative data and what the issues are, what some of the challenges that we face, and how wonderful and imaginative scholars like Jameson are pushing the boundaries and helping us to reimagine and rethink how we work with data with Indigenous populations. And then we'll finish up by thinking through some of the limitations and what are the possibilities with data when it comes to Indigenous students and Indigenous populations. And we'll leave a few minutes for questions and answers. So we're excited to get started with you all. Shelley, were you able to get your sound to work?
There's an icon at the bottom of your screen in a hop-in room that is a microphone, and that'll unmute you. Do you see that? It's right at the bottom of your screen. If you click over to the hop-in tab. Yeah, we can't hear you because you're muted, and I can see the icon is still selected. And Ben will give you a call and he can help you out if we've got your phone number.
So we'll
Go ahead, Shelley, you can leave and come back into the room. Why don't you do that? Just leave and come back in, and we'll have Heather continue.
All right, thank you. Jameson, do you want to add anything to our overview? Anything you want to share as we introduce?
No, I mean, I'm excited to be here. It's nice to take a break from teaching a kindergarten and first grader and be with you all virtually. I just look forward to the conversations we could have, and hopefully we could give you some good, I don't know, just a good dialogue, I guess, all around, and help move some of this work forward. So I appreciate the invitation.
Thank
We've
you.
got Shelley back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
All right.
Do you want to add anything to that overview and our introduction?
Nope. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right. So Shelley and I wanted to start by talking about really how we entered into these conversations about data and visibility. So for us, it really started as a conversation, goodness, over 15 years ago, as student affairs practitioners in higher education, and as we gathered at the University of Illinois with a group of other Indigenous higher education scholars and student affairs practitioners. One of the things that many of us had noticed over the years, and other people had pointed out, Shelley pointed out this issue of invisibility in some of her early work as a graduate student, but we were really lamenting about what we struggled with in terms of the higher education research, particularly, that there was a real dearth of research, and particularly when it came to large data sets. And what we noticed was this kind of phenomenon of the exclusion of Indigenous students and Indigenous people from the research. And so what started as a conversation about our populations being invisible and not having research and data to help inform the work that we were doing with Indigenous college students blossomed into this bigger project that became the book Beyond the Asterisk. And so in those early conversations, we were really exploring how exactly are Indigenous students and Indigenous people erased, or more specifically invisibilized in data. And so this is where this conversation of the research asterisk really emerged amongst many of us. John Garland, Shelley Lowe have been working through some of this. And what we noticed was what many of us have probably noticed. Sometimes when you go to large data sets, you see different populations, particularly minoritized populations represented, but you see an absence of Indigenous populations. Sometimes there might be a notation, normally with an asterisk of some sort, that Indigenous populations weren't included because of issues with small sample size. And so there's a lot, there's a much more complex conversation I think JD will get into about the issues of sample size and validity and how we're thinking about that. But for us, that's where that conversation really began. It was about being excluded from the data, essentially written out. And so in that first piece of work and Beyond the Asterisk, we really started to and attempted to address the pervasiveness of Indigenous invisibility in research, and particularly in large data sets. And one of the things that we talked about was the way that Indigenous people are often excluded from institutional data and reporting, the ways that Indigenous people are omitted from higher education curriculum, and really how we're kind of written out of the higher education story in general. And so it was this critique, particularly of not just our institutions, but the research in general, and how we have been excluded and really kind of written out of that. And so thinking about how the issues of data and visibility for us extend beyond like small n, or small sample size or population size, or issues of statistical significance, or validity, and really thinking about what the underlying issues are with the Indigenous research asterisk. That what underlies all of that is the insidious nature of Indigenous erasure. By excluding Indigenous people, and for us, Indigenous students, from data, we are perpetuating the erasure of Indigenous people and settler colonial aims. And so that's how that conversation really began. If we can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we noticed over the years is that when we took a survey of particularly our area, higher education, of the research, 1% or less of the research or the scholarship addressed Indigenous students. And so there was this perpetual issue of exclusion or invisibility within research, and particularly quantitative research or anything that dealt with large data sets. And Shelley, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. One of the things that, and we're going to talk about why this is a problem, besides the fact that it was extremely frustrating to try to look for research that addressed the issues, the experiences, the successes of Native students in higher education, not being able to find anything. What we often find is that individuals who do research on diversity or underrepresented groups often make the assumption that Indigenous experiences, the experiences of Native students, Native Hawaiian students, Pacific Islander students, are the same as other underrepresented groups. So they're the same as Latinx students, they're the same as African American students. And the reality of that is they're not the same, that Native students do really come from a very unique background and have different experiences in our higher education institutions. But if we don't take that into consideration, what we find is that student affairs professionals and individuals who work in higher education will often think, oh, I can use the information and the research about how to support Latinx students or how to support African American students, and I can use those same strategies to work with Indigenous students. And oftentimes we find that that still doesn't work. One of the issues that we have to admit to ourselves and as institutions and as staff who work in higher education is that when we don't look at the experiences of Native and Indigenous students, when we don't actively evaluate and research them as a part of the population, when we look at underrepresented students, we ourselves as institutions are failing our Native students and failing Indigenous students. And we are part of the reason why they may not have higher graduation rates. They may not have higher completion rates. Right? We always want to look, people always want to look and say, oh, Native and Indigenous students, they have such low graduation rates. But the reality is that's because we have not done a good job within institutions, gathering data, doing research, doing what we need to do to figure out what are the best ways to serve and really help students, Native and Indigenous students, be successful. The other thing that we look at, and what causes a problem when we don't look at Indigenous and Native students in our data, is that we actually often, not just when we ignore Native students in general, but when we do collect information and data on Native students, we often ignore the diversity that comes among Native students. Like, we are one of the most diverse populations in higher education. We have students who are various tribal memberships, tribal citizenships. We have students that are 2 or more races. We have a major array of diversity, but we're not addressing that as well. When we do address Native and Indigenous issues, we often seem to assume that they're all the same, that we can have a study about Native students in California, and it's going to be the same experiences for Native students in Northern New England. And the tribes are not the same, and their issues are not the same, and their experiences within these higher educations are not going to be the same. We're also ignoring the fact that Native students are not a racial group. Native students are a political group. They have political status as citizens of sovereign tribal nations, nations who often have relationships with higher education institutions, who support higher education institutions, and who are expecting our institutions to provide information on how well we are supporting their students. Tribal nations want to know how their tribal students, their enrolled, their citizens are doing in institutions. And when we can't tell them specifically, oh, your students are doing this this well or not this well. When we just say, oh, Native students in general are doing this, we can't always assume that it means that their tribal students are having the same experiences as other tribal students. The other problem, and when we don't include Native and Indigenous students in our data and in our research and in our reports within our institutions, is it allows us as institutions to also ignore Indigenous inclusion in curriculum, right? If we don't talk about them, if we don't report on them, if we don't, acknowledge the fact that Native students are here, we don't have to think about whether or not they're in our curriculum. We also don't have to think about whether or not the curriculum we are teaching is actually teaching accurate history, accurate experiences of Indigenous peoples, right? We don't have to think about that when we don't have information, when we don't have data, when we are not reporting on Native students. And the research shows that Native students in higher education are continually confronting curriculum that keeps them invisible, curriculum that is inaccurate, and curriculum that teaches their peers that they don't have to think about the realities of Native people. They don't have to think about it in their academic work, and they don't have to think about it once they've graduated and they've gone on into careers. And this poses an even bigger problem, perpetuating the invisibility of Native people. We also find that if we can't and we don't include Native students, we don't report on them, we don't have to really pay attention to the institutional history, and more importantly, the history of the land and the location of where our institutions sit, right? If we don't have to think about Native students, we don't have to think about what's the history of how our institution was created, what is the history of how our institution came to be on the lands that they sit on. What happened to those lands? Who were originally on those lands? How were those lands dispossessed from Native people? Allowing for institutions to come in to be built and to not have to think about that past in any way. Institutions who don't think about that also don't tend to think about what is their relationship to the tribes, to the tribal nations, not just in their local area, but also in their state or in their region. Because institutions do really have a responsibility to think about who's in their population area, who are they serving, and with no data and no information on Native students, individuals and institutions are not having to think very clearly about how they serve tribes, how they are serving tribal populations. And this then affects how states and elected tribal or elected national leaders, whether or not they think that they have to think about these tribes when they do their work as well. So it creates a lot of problems that are not just within the institutions, but cause problems outside the institution and perpetuate into even larger areas, including politics across the country.
One of the things that we have that we wanted to make sure that we address is the really kind of specific and nuanced ways that institutions perpetuate data invisibility. And so Shelley and JD and I wanted to provide some examples of the way that we encounter that. And I think Shelley started off with great examples in thinking about how Indigenous students are othered when institutions collect data on minoritized populations, so often excluded from that, and what some of the inconveniences are with that kind of data collection, or how we exclude Indigenous students in very specific ways. So Jameson and Shelley, if you want to jump in with some specific examples that we can think of.
Yeah, I could jump in for a little bit. Thanks everyone again for having me. Some of the things that I've come across, one of the biggest issues that we've seen, I'm sure as well, is that, just this idea of who's kind of Native and marking American Indian, Alaska Native versus non-Native within a lot of this data. That's including not just institutional data, but federal data. A lot of students seem to think just because if you mark, I'm Native, that somehow there's going to be some kind of monetary benefit, whether it be scholarships or extra money from different organizations and whatnot. And what that continues to do within the data is it just creates more invisibility of like what's actually happening among Native folks. But even more, if you dive into that a little bit more, there was a mention of like there's almost 600 federally recognized tribes even more state recognized tribes. And even there's politics around blood quantum within individual tribal governments of like who's Native and who's not Native. So there's a lot of nuances to be able to examine. So even if you were to say, take a simple random sample across the United States of Indigenous folks, it wouldn't be necessarily a representation of all Native folks, particularly because each individual nations have their own set of cultural customs, language, ceremonies, you name it. And so, you know, that's one of the issues that we keep seeing is this idea of like grouping Natives together when in reality, we should probably be more disaggregated within the data. And so that's something that I've seen within institutional data when it's just marking American Indian, Alaska Native, as opposed to looking at maybe some of the actual tribal affiliations that Native students have coming from different tribes. And it's the same within the federal arena where I've worked on the National Indian Education Study for the last three years. And it's one of the issues that we have too, is just how do Native students are, you know, marking their tribes. And we've asked for little things like a Dropbox, you know, and to be able to pick their tribes, but it's just not quite possible yet. And again, it gets really, it's a lot more nuanced than even how we're collecting this data within those different places. So.
And I think to add to that, we've made some of us have made some very specific calls in those larger national data sets, but particularly within our institutions with how we're collecting that data. There are other ways that we think about once the IPEDS data changed on the data we collect on race, what was that, 2015-ish, somewhere around there? Yeah, that it has shifted, and we're witnessing those shifts in our institutional data on our student populations. And so once the impact of two or more races on how Indigenous students are counted is another area that I think many of us are having to contend with within our institutions. And then asking, it's important to collect tribal citizenship data because again, it's the distinction of Indigenous students as a political group and not just a racial group. So it's what Brian Brayboy talks about, the liminality of Indigenous people, of being both racialized and a political group. And so honoring that the sovereign status of tribal nations is an important aspect, but it's a really difficult conversation, as many of you are probably aware, within our own institutions. And how we do that, is that a drop-down menu? Do we include all 574 federally recognized tribes? What state recognized tribes do we include? You know, and when you talk to your institutional data and reporting folks, sometimes that's a really difficult conversation.
Yeah, and this even gets more difficult. And we know, you know, that there are lots of reasons to say, oh, well, it's very difficult to try to get data on Native students. But the other part of making sure that we disaggregate two or more races, that we capture tribal identity through citizenship or descendancy or affiliation, is also understanding that borders have crossed tribal nations, country borders between Canada, the United States, Mexico, the United States. Our students are still tribal citizens, and they can be tribal citizens and living in Canada, but be considered national and in-state students or domestic students in the United States. We always have to take that into consideration as well, which is an extra step. And there's a treaty, there's J Treaty that covers this, but a lot of institutions don't take the time to understand. If we're breaking down tribal identity, there are extra steps that we can take. There are extra things that we need to look at. The other part about thinking about Indigenous students and is even more important, I would almost argue, because of the population size, which is growing, is how to disaggregate Pacific Islander students from Asian American students. Pacific Islander students are often looped in with Asian Americans, and their experiences and how we support them is often focused on how we think about Asian American students. But Pacific Islander students are often more alike and have the experiences of Indigenous students, Native students, but they're not counted in the work that we do to focus on Indigenous students.
Right before we move into Jameson talking a little bit more about how we unpack Indigenous quantitative data, I think we wanted to note that, you know, these early conversations about data invisibility and the ever-present research asterisk for Indigenous students has been an ongoing conversation. And really those early conversations were about framing the invisibility as an absence or an exclusion from the higher education data. And more recently, a number of scholars have really started to explore how we can approach this. How do we, they really answered those early calls, and scholars like Jameson have started to answer those calls by thinking through what are the issues with, from a quantitative perspective, with data invisibility, and how do we start to reframe discussions of population size through an Indigenous lens. And so Jameson is doing some really great work and is going to talk to us more about how we unpack Indigenous quantitative data.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Schotten. Yeah, so one of the biggest issues that we've seen within data is this issue of small sample sizes. And it seems to plague just about anyone trying to conduct any type of research with an Indigenous population. And it's something that I've seen since coming into academia, and something that I've just found to be almost like there hasn't been enough attention paid to it. And the solutions seem fairly easy. I'm somewhat new to this work and even to quantitative work. I've been working with Indigenous students, you know, using data for the last 7 years, since 2013. I've worked with various organizations, scholarship organizations at the federal level, institutional data, and then also even just tribal data, and working with tribal governments on how to collect data around their populations. And so it seems like there's always this issue around small sample sizes, and it's something that's not necessarily new. Since 1928, Indigenous folks have been advocating for better data. In 1928, there was a report that came out called the Merriam Report, and it was kind of giving an overview of what native land looked like during the time, looking at the economic kind of development, health data, and then there was also education. And in the education area, they started talking about, like, we needed to oversample Native students. We needed to oversample different communities. They talked about other things around education, such as we needed highly qualified teachers. We needed better variables and standardized measurements, just because we couldn't be able to, you know, measure Native students against what everybody else was doing. And so it just ended up being like this large report, and that was almost 100 years ago. And you flash forward to 2018, and you look at the Broken Promises report, and it's almost saying the same thing about, like, we need to oversample Native students. The data is inconsistent. You know, we still need highly qualified teachers. The standardized testing is off. In 1928, they're asking questions to Native students about using these examples about boats, and, you know, Native students are like, you know, what's a boat in 1928, and not thinking about it. And then, you know, 2018, you can look at NAEP data, and they're talking about, okay, if you go down 3 blocks, make a right, you know, and go down 2 more blocks, where will you be? And, you know, these Native kids up in the White Mountain Apache Reservation are like, what the hell's a block? You know, they have these little neighborhoods that are like called Over the Rainbow and 7 Mile, and they're kind of like, you go over the cattle guard and you make a ride, and there's a big tree and there's some elephant feet. It looks like that. And that's where my house is. And so if you ever seen some of the driver's license addresses of some of our Native students, you would understand, like, some of the locations and how drivers get out there are exactly stated like that on their licenses. And so, you know, keeping all of that in mind, like, this isn't something new. And then even into the 90s, when folks were still advocating for oversampling of Native students in federal and institutional data, you could think of up to now, even with Dr. Schotten and Shelley's work in Beyond the Asterisk. And it's just a continuous thing. And so at what point, I kind of came to the conclusion, with the guidance of Dr. Schotten, you know, maybe it's time to start collecting my own data around these issues. And that's really where I find much of the solutions to these problems. The problem, again, becomes that we do have treaties with the United States government. So the federal does have an obligation and a duty to be able to provide a certain amount of education, understand the educational landscape of Indigenous nations. But then also at the same time, if it's not happening, it, you know, it falls back on us to be able to find those data sets. But what I've seen is like more collaboration seem to be something that's really useful to address some of these limitations. And when you think about the limitations of the current data sets, just using statistical validity, you know, there's a I want to say she's Dr. Stephanie Carroll. She's in public health, and she wrote this really good piece about some of the limitations of federal data and institutional data. And she's saying, like, you know, there's a lack of relevant variables, there's inconsistency within that data, it's irrelevant, poor quality, and produced and used within an environment of mistrust. And when you look through a lot of the federal data, you think about, oh yeah, you know, these variables may not even be consistent with what the experiences of Native students are actually going through. The inconsistency comes in when it's like, okay, you know, one student could come in and say, you know, my parents told me that my grandma was a Cherokee princess. And so to them, they believe they're Native, but then in the following sequence in longitudinal data, maybe a year or two later, they may say, well, I'm actually not Native. And so that's where this inconsistency within longitudinal data comes irrelevant. Again, this idea of like having these variables that are just not relevant to the Native community, poor quality, and then produced and used within an environment of mistrust. A lot of Indigenous nations aren't trustful of data itself for obvious reasons, because it's used to, you know, do harm to Native communities. And so it's also an idea of like gaining the trust of tribal nations to be able to, you know, better use or to get the input on what's actually happening. But there are some solutions to this. And one of the things that I found to be probably the most relevant is just creating our own data and also creating our own measurement scales. How can I put this? When you really just think about this idea of the lack of variables there and the lack of sample size, I think it really has to do with this idea of folks not really understanding Indigenous communities themselves. Earlier, I alluded to this idea of like, well, we have almost 600 federally recognized tribes and even more state recognized tribes, and this idea that they're not the same. So, you know, maybe a better way to do this would be actually to collect data by region or by something that's actually relevant to Indigenous folks, such as creation stories. You know, for example, I'll give this quick example. My nation, the Quetzal Nation, we have about 3,900 tribal members, which is quite small. And every given year, we only maybe have about 40 to 50 higher education students. The neighboring tribe that's just across the river, the Kokopah tribe, they have something around, I think, 1,800 tribal members and maybe about 30 students that go into higher education in a given year. And so in my mind, it's like, well, we come from a similar area, geographic region, but more importantly, we share a lot of commonalities. It makes sense for us to overcome this idea of a small sample size to collect the data together. And not only that, it allows us to generate a larger sample and meet some of these statistical limitations, but more importantly, it allows us to create more relevant variables. One of the difficult things that we have measuring within Indigenous communities is culture. And in my mind, you know, well, if you have these similar tribes with creation stories, it gives us the opportunity to measure those difficult constructs such as culture. And you could use theories such as the peoplehood paradigm and saying like, you know, all right, it's this idea of like, you know, having land, kinship, sacred history, and, you know, start measuring these cultural ideas against those types of concepts. So then that way you do have relevant variables within your data set. That's also kind of a solution to what I see with even this idea of identity, is like, as opposed to just asking, are you Native or not Native, maybe we should be asking like, what is actually your Native experience? And understanding like, well, do you understand who your relatives are? Do you speak your language? Do you understand some of your ceremonies, or do you participate in your ceremonies, and so forth? And so to me, those are actually more relevant variables to what's actually happening within the Native community, and gives us a better understanding, because even within tribal communities, you could have somebody that grew up on a reservation, speaks the language, participates in ceremonies, but isn't actually a tribal member because of blood quantum. They could be a quarter or an eighth, and the requirement could be a quarter by the tribe. So you have somebody that participates in the culture, but by a technicality isn't included into being native, but in my mind, they're really native. Or you could compare them to somebody like me who grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood in North Phoenix, traveling back to my reservation for summers and ceremonies or whatever. You know, to me, that individual or that student who grew up on the reservation in our tribal community their whole life, you know, they have a different cultural tribal experience. Not to say that I'm not native or they're not native, but it's just we have a different experience, and maybe those are the questions we should be asking. And, you know, it also, I'm talking a little bit about Indigenous data collection right now. And the last part, I guess I'll hit too, because I don't want to take too much time, is this idea of like what our outcomes are. You know, in higher education, in the fields that we work in, we tend to look at first to second year persistence, GPA, graduation rates. I feel like I know those variables are those outcomes are really important to our tribal communities. They're important to me too. But if I was to sit down with my tribal elders, like I have many times in the past, and I'd be like, you know, what's important to you of someone that's in the age category of 18 to 24, you know, GPA and graduation rates aren't going to be on their top priority list. And, you know, when I think about that, about like, okay, like maybe we're putting too much emphasis on these outcome variables. And if we were to take it from an Indigenous perspective, what would those outcomes look like? And to me, one of the issues that we see, not just within Indigenous community, but even a lot of minoritized communities, is this idea of like, you know, students our native students go to college because they want to give back to their communities. And so it's almost like, okay, well, maybe we could look at, instead of first and second year persistence, let's see how a number of semesters completed influences, you know, native students giving back in their tribal community, as opposed to just GPA or persistence or graduation rates. Because the thing is I feel like a lot of native students, even if they may not complete college, it doesn't mean they're not successful in an educational sense. I think they're still successful, but we're using the wrong metrics. And it's almost to the point where it can almost look like a deficit approach. You could look over the years, and consistently native students are, you know, kind of here at the bottom. And to Shelley's point too, is like, you know, the data is not being collected to be able to address that. But I think also is that we're not including variables that are very important to tribal communities, such as giving back, and looking at like, well, we shouldn't look at how giving back influences first and second year persistence. We should flip the model and start looking at the outcomes based in the community voices. Django Paris has a really great work around this in culturally sustaining pedagogy in 2016. And him and Alim wrote, you know, that the outcome variables need to be based in the values of the community. And I think that's something that as researchers and people who collect data, is that we need to start considering is like, all right, how is this, you know, privileging the voices of the communities that we work in and that we care about? And there's lots of ways to do that. Again, I've talked about that relationship between tribal nations. Right now, I'm working with a few native scholarship organizations, and we're collecting data. And, you know, it's around college affordability, but, you know, we always seem to run into some kind of limitation within the data. And what I continually to tell the folks that I work with, whether they be from a tribal government or they be from some kind of organization or institution, is like, you know, no matter what data we're collecting on native students, it's better than any of the data that exists out there from a federal institutional perspective. You know, like I had 150 students in my sample, and I tell everybody it's the most badass data set around Quezon students that exist in this world. You know, and I feel like the same thing, you know, when I talk about like the college affordability, I was like, this is like the best data set that exists in the world, because it's going to allow us to disaggregate by tribe, by region. We can use creation stories. There's variables around culture. There's variables around giving back. And I'm like, people aren't asking those questions in relation to college affordability. And I was like, we have that now. And now we're able to actually show what's happening within Indigenous communities that hasn't been happening. So I encourage you all, it doesn't take a large amount of money to do this work. You know, you could go in and start doing it. But It helps if you have money, don't get me wrong. But I'm telling you, like, there's lots that can be done, you know, on an individual perspective by just one person that could really change the outlook of the indigenous communities and how we're looking at students for that matter. And I'll go ahead and end right there and turn it back over.
No, you were on a roll. We were going to church. But I think that Jameson brings up some really good points that we have also continued to talk about in our conversations, particularly around what are the limitations and what are the kind of what are the challenges that we come up against when we're thinking about data, particularly within indigenous populations. And there's lots going on in the chat that we can see. Lots of people are connecting to what you've offered, Jameson, and just thinking about like this this point that you've made about identity, right? So one of the limitations that we think about is these imposed Shelley talked earlier about borders crossing indigenous tribes. The same when it comes to identity, then we're pushing back against imposed measurements, right? Imposed measurements of blood quantum that are not a part of our tribal ways. Sometimes imposed groupings of tribes that are federally recognized tribes that maybe weren't originally together, and how we're thinking about that. And how we're pushing back against those imposed measurements. So the example that you gave with your own tribe and returning creation stories is a great response to the impositions, particularly the colonial impositions on indigenous people of identity, and returning to the peoplehood model and the peoplehood paradigm to think about, well, what makes a people? And it's not the federal government that defines who we are, but it's our stories and our own knowledge systems that define who we are. And so I think we wanted to talk a little bit more about what are the specific limitations in data that we run up against and that we continue to grapple with.
Yeah, and I think I've been kind of watching the chats. So Jameson brings up a really great point, right? A lot of us in our own work, Native and Indigenous people, and lots of you in your work are doing the collection of information that our institutions are not doing, right? So we are collecting different parts of identity of our students that the institutions don't naturally collect. And it's, as Jameson says, it's creating a really rich data set that we use on a regular basis, but doesn't get used within some of the reporting that the institution might do. So some of the things to think about, and when we talk to institutions about how data and experiences from students get collected, is why are we looking at comparing Asian American, Latinx, African American, and Native students? Why aren't we taking these groups as they are and disaggregating within those groups and talking about the diversity of experiences within those actual groupings? Instead of saying, oh, well, we're just going to go out and research about diversity. No, I'm going to go out and research about the diversity within African American, African, students who are here in the United States, because we can't keep saying, oh, the African American experience is all the same, the Latinx experience is all the same, or the Asian American experience is all the same. It's not. And we do a disservice when we collect that information together and think about it as diversity. We also have every right within our institutions. We're higher education institutions. We get ourselves very siloed. We're very good about that. We should be including, as Jameson said, community members within the work that we do. If we're not meeting communities' needs, what are we doing within the institutions with our Native and Indigenous students, right? We're failing communities. We're failing the students if we are not meeting their communities' needs. And very often, about education conversation, we're not bringing them into the research, we're not making them a part of the. We should be reaching beyond our institute. Those individuals are the experts, and we have to treat them like they're the experts. We have to get them involved in the work that we're doing.
I think that, oh, go ahead, Jameson.
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna piggyback. I agree, and a lot of times within quantitative research, there's this idea that especially in the traditional quant type work, there's this really super positivist viewpoint on how we're approaching the work and being objective to what we're looking at. But in reality, I think as all quantitative researchers, if we were truly to admit it, our work is subjective to the variables that we include in the data, what we're looking at, how we decide what analysis to do. It's all subjected to that. And it's also an idea of like when you decide to exclude Native students, that's by your choice. And so like everything that we're doing is it's subjective. And there's this great book called Indigenous Statistics by Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson. And in there, within, I think this is the first 3 or 4 chapters, they have a good framework for Indigenous quantitative methodology. And even as if you're into critical quantitative methods, it's a good place to start as far as just looking at how you're looking at the community, because as Shelley was saying, the community voice is really important to all of this work, and even to the point of like how you're constructing the measurements that you're using, the very items and variables and questions, especially within survey research. Do you have input from the community for what you're about to ask? And is it relevant? And that's again going back to this idea of providing content validity, and or construct validity too, as well as just your measurements themselves. And I think a lot of the statistical problems that we have is just because we're not asking good questions within those items. And then that again plays into the idea of the need for more qualitative research to be able to develop those types of things.
Right. And I think, that's a really great point when we think about those limitations. Again, we're talking about impositions, and the idea that any research is value neutral is inaccurate, because the decision to exclude Indigenous students or to exclude any population, there's a value in that's a decision, and whether intentional or unintentional perpetuates erasure. And then when we think about measurements, right? So what are the complications and limitations or the problems of measurements or tools that we have? So I think about your work, Jameson, and in having to develop your own scale for giving back. So on the qualitative side, Shelley and I are both qualitative researchers. A lot of our research and the scholarship was pointing to the fact that motivation for Native students or Indigenous students for higher education was really centered in a value of giving back, or this value of reciprocity and the desire to go back and give back to their community. But we didn't have a way to really measure that in a kind of larger scale, or how do we even really measure that beyond the qualitative data that we had? And so I think, with some of the work that Jameson has had in developing a tool to actually measure that, but some of the problems that come along with that, because the tools and the measurements that we have are based on very specific populations that don't address our values. So everything that Shelley's been saying and that Jameson have been saying about, then how do we frame these things in community values or Indigenous values? So it meant actually coming up with your own measurement, your own instrument, and what that was like.
Yeah, I think for me, that's probably one of the best solutions that we have, especially when it comes to quantitative data, is developing our own measures. I know that within the realm of higher education, there's a few scales, and especially within psychology and counseling. I know I've seen a few scales around and that are particular for Indigenous folks and the experiences that Indigenous students have. And so for me, that's one of the best things that we can do, is like having more folks that are involved in that process and making sure that we're continually going back into the Indigenous community and having those voices presented, even at an institutional perspective of having Native students having their feedback into that. If you're working in a tribal community, obviously having the tribal community have their input in that. And then even at a federal level, is just making sure you're always grounded in the community. And I think as Indigenous researchers, that's one of the great benefits we have, is we always have somebody in the background keeping us grounded. Because if you go to, like, you know, I know every time I go to my tribal council and I ask for IRB permission to conduct a research project, they're always like, well, who the hell cares about what you're doing? You know, and so it reminds me, oh, okay, like, what does this mean for us? You know, what is it going to do for us? And, you know, I think for me, that's where I always have to realize, like, as, you know, the purpose in my life and what I want to do to help my tribal community, it's always based in the needs of the community. So really just staying grounded, I think, is important to this all. And I feel like qualitative research helps us do that, because even most of the items I've ever developed in the past has been based in Heather's work, as well as Shelley's work, and many other great, phenomenal Indigenous women scholars that have done some phenomenal work. And so for me, it's learning how to kind of make that dance between the qualitative research and the quantitative as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, we want everyone to leave here knowing that it can be done, that it really does take time and it takes real effort. And sometimes the easiest way to start is to gather just some of that summative data. Have a good sense of how many students come from which tribes, right? I can look at my data within my institution and I can say, oh, you know, I have 52 students from Choctaw. I have 12 students from Navajo. That helps me figure out how to do some of my work, and it helps me answer questions when other individuals and my colleagues come and say, oh, tell us about your population, right? As long as you start to break down and disaggregate some of that small data into summative data that you can talk about, that's a start. And from there, you can start to think about, okay, now what are the things that I need to know within this disaggregated data that will really help to assess the diversity of this group, their needs, what is going on, how do we need to kind of think about what this means. I often, and I think all of us, recommend that you have advisory groups, tribal advisory groups, particularly members of tribes that are local to your institution. One of the things that I think we also forget to think about is the fact that local tribes are very invested in how Native students from all over the world are doing in their traditional territory. They're not just tribes that are interested in their own students, they're actually often tribes who are interested in knowing, I want to make sure that a student who comes to higher education in my state, a Native student, Indigenous student, is doing well, is having, is feeling comfortable, is feeling like they belong. And if they find out that students aren't doing that, we often have tribes who want to get involved and say, okay, I want to be a part of this. How do I help? How can we make sure that students leave or their time here is really good and they go away from here and they understand that they were a part of our community, they were on our land, and they were supported while they were on our lands.
Yeah, right. I noticed this a comment in the chat, right? This notion of different ways that our communities talk about the collective or the value of the collective or how we exist in relationship to one another, right? And so what in Shelley's description here, that this value of what is, how we are in relationship to others, and that we exist because we exist in relationship to others. So I think we wanted to open up for Q&A, right? Shelley, how do you want to handle this? Do we want to just go to the chat or?
I will moderate the Q&A for you all. So folks, if you have questions, if you can start typing them into the chat. And while folks are doing that, thank you guys so much. You have hit so many points about the complexity of this conversation. I think there's a lot we can unpack. But I wanted to start with just what your thoughts are on ways that the community colleges that we have in the room can really take a lead on this work. I mean, I think you had a whole bunch of tips throughout that many of you gave us about how to really start this work of looking at students more holistically in terms of their identity and making sure we don't have these groups of students who are invisible in our reporting. And I think there's a real opportunity for community colleges to take a lead on that work that you all have started in the four-year sector.
Well, I think one thing is that the great thing is that the very model of community colleges position you so that you are already in relationship with the community. And so thinking about your location, the other piece is that when we look at where Native students are attending college, then we have to think about what the representation of Indigenous students is in the community college sector, but particularly thinking about the relationship that already exists. That's really the nature of our community colleges. And so then how does that relationship extend to local tribal governments or tribal communities, or Indigenous populations if you're in an urban setting? So how do you connect to Indigenous communities and think about being in partnership with them to, as Jameson said so eloquently, like develop research or collect data that actually matters to those communities. Like, what the hell does that have to do with them, right? So how do you develop approaches in relationship and in partnership with those communities to make sure that you're collecting the data that needs to be collected?
And I want to give a quick shout out to Arizona Western College. It's actually the community college that's close to my reservation. I went and gave a talk there in February of 2019. By fall 2019, I had made a suggestion that maybe they should have dual enrollment courses on our high school reservation to help increase enrollment among Native students. And it took Dr. Ellen maybe 6 months to be able to manage that with her college president and start doing that. And so already we're seeing a lot of benefits from our high school students entering in from high school into the community college and helping bridge some of those gaps. And so I think that's a part of that community relationship, and then also collecting data around that. I know on another practical point, institutional assessments are sometimes limited on what you can do. And so even being able to gather, for example, you may not be able to gather specific travel information, but even being able to disaggregate, like, okay, who marked their Native, and then sending them separate kind of surveys and monitoring them separately. I think that's another great place to start, and really researching, like, who has these scales that have been made from an Indigenous perspective that we could already send out that are already existing, and not having to remake it from the beginning, And so I think those are a few practical suggestions too.
Right, and I think one of the things that we should always be aware of too is, as Jameson alluded to earlier, we have a lot of students who identify as Native when they apply to an institution. We need to make sure that we capture data when a student applies. We need to make sure we capture data again when a student matriculates. We need to make sure we capture data again a year later, because very often those students who identify as being Native but don't really have that identity change that identity and no longer are thinking about themselves as a Native students, but we're still capturing them oftentimes as Native students because that's how they identified when they came in. And this could go for other groups of students as well. It's not specific to Indigenous students.
Yeah, it shifts the other way too. We can go back to student identity development, but it shifts the other way too. It might strengthen for an Indigenous student whose identity strengthens in their time in college. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important point, right? We know identity changes, yet we often collect that one time and don't actually allow it to move within the data we're reporting. So that's a huge reminder. I also don't want to lose the point that you guys have made multiple times, which is this community connection, leveraging our localness, as Dr. Stout put into the chat, should also be part of our data and research agendas. That is not something just for the Board of Trustees to do or for the folks who are directly working with partners, but as we think about our data needs and who we're collecting data for, that we make sure we include the community in that conversation, right? Okay, we are starting to get some more questions in the chat. So the first one was, what are some ways beyond just surveys to figure out what the tribal and community needs are, not just for data, but also for curriculum?
I mean, I think it's that begins with developing relationships, and that takes time. It takes some real intention setting from your institution, and developing relationships with tribes requires developing trust, and that might take years. And so beyond just surveys, I think it takes going into those communities and meeting with tribes or indigenous communities, and having that be a reciprocal relationship. Oftentimes institutions, their only relationships with tribes center around money and research. So, and generally research that generates money from grants. So when it's time for the latest NSF or NIH grant, or whatever it might be, then our institutions are rushing out to tribes to ask them to partner, but they're already starting at step 4, and not beginning with the relationship building. So I think that, to me, that's always step 1, is developing those relationships, and that's important to maintain those.
Yeah, and I do think that you can take time, right? You can host focus groups, you can host listening sessions, talking circles. One of the best things that institutions can do is host a tribal forum. Bring the tribal leaders in to talk about what is it they want to see, what are their needs, what are their issues, and have that be conversations with some of the students who can also talk about what their needs and their issues are, right? Part of it is bringing them in and taking the time to listen.
Sure, for sure. And again, that's that partnering, right, of the qualitative with the quantitative. So we also have 2, what I think may be related questions. One is a question about, are there any national data sets that do a decent job of this work to just kind of create a baseline understanding as colleges start to dive more deeply into their own populations? And also for the colleges that are located in places where they are not near tribal land, are there some national organizations that they can partner with to still be able to do this work?
I could answer the question about the national data sets. I actually wrote a review of higher education data sets. It's a paper I wrote in 2018, and I'm talking about the BPS data, NAPSAS, iPads, and a few other ones in there. Basically, the problem still becomes is the small sample sizes within those data sets that limit a lot of researchers from doing anything. The BPS data may be the only exception, and also, well, I'll take it back, the NAPSAS also. But again, the limitation is that it doesn't disaggregate by tribe. For example, if there's 700, I think, participants, say in the NAPSAS, of those 700 participants, they all mark that they're Native. Who in there really is Native, and then what tribes are they from? Like, again, we've taken, there's 600, almost 600 federally recognized tribes in the United States. I think it's 574, like Heather said. And if we were to take a simple random sample across the nation, the likelihood of that data set having anybody from the Quetzal Nation, where I'm from, is probably 0. The likelihood of it being mostly Cherokee, Navajo, and some of the larger tribes is really high. And so then you have a study that's about Navajo and Cherokee, not necessarily about Quetzals, but the policies are made for my tribal nation, and it's something that we always have in Arizona as well. If we were to take a simple random sample, it's not going to be a study about all 22 tribes in Arizona. It's going to be a study probably about Navajo and Apache. And so it's one of those problems that we try to address. So, I mean, for me in particular, I've stayed away from most of the higher education data sets, other than iPads, where I try to pair it to look at, okay, what's going on at the institutional level, and let's see what those populations look like, their Native populations. in relation to the number of Native faculty, tuition rates, and so forth, and then pairing it with some of like the data that I collect at the individual level of students and seeing who's doing a good job of graduating our students and that kind of thing. And so I see it more as, you know, like, let's use that data, but let's, you know, merge it with some other data set that we're collecting to help it make more sense to Indigenous students themselves. And then the other question about not having tribes in the you know, certain states, to me it's always about your students too. And so seeing where the students are from, I think, is the main thing. And then going from there, having student organizations, Native student organizations, and going to them and seeing what their needs are. And then, you know, the thing is too, is that, you know, even if you don't have reservations in your community, you're still on Indigenous land. And so that might be a start, as well as figuring out, you know, whose land did I used to, that was here that I now occupy. You know, I think that's another approach you could take to it as well.
Yeah, and I think that when we think about those folks that are in places where there currently aren't tribal nations that either because of removal or for whatever reasons, there is likely a population or an urban group that you can connect with. But I think, like JD said, finding out what tribes your students represent and connecting with them. So if you're in, say, the far Northeast and you have students who represent tribes from back in Oklahoma or Arizona, Shelley likely has experience with this, then how do you create connections with their tribal nations? And then thinking about organizations, national organizations like the National Indian Education Association are great partners to think about for those spaces.
Yeah, so, and you know, those national organizations, National Congress of American Indians, National Indian Education Association, and for those institutions that are east of the Mississippi, the United Southern and Eastern Tribes is a good organization to reach out to.
Great. Thank you. That was a lot of tips, I think, to help folks get started. I do want to also just ask a follow-up on this small sample size issue. I think often one of the places we see the small sample size issue make students invisible is when we do summary charts and infographics, right? So we want to do the 1 page, here are our students at the college, and what gets dropped off is all of our smaller groups, right? Because they're visually, they're just a little sliver. So what recommendations do you have for us to make sure we're making all of our students visible, even when we're trying to do those high level summaries?
So,
You can do.
Oh, sorry, I'll let you.
I would say you can do 2 levels of summaries. You do one with the larger groups, and then you take your smaller groups and you create another summary. That way, the other part of it is, it's always hard for us as Native and Indigenous people and people from smaller populations in higher ed to look at those infographics and say, oh yeah, there we are, that really tiny sliver, or that, you know, we're down there at that bottom near 0 line. So disaggregate those and create them in a different line. So at least we can see each other next to, you know, the other populations that are very small as well.
Well,
I think
but to add to, sorry, the other side of that is to look at that information or see yourself at all, right? So it's even more dehumanizing to look at that, and even for all of us, like if we're in situations and every time we're in sessions at conferences, or if I'm reviewing work or reviewing a manuscript and I see something that has to do with minority populations or whatever, and then I don't see Indigenous students represented, the first question is, where are we, right? So the other side of that is not just we're that tiny sliver, it's the question of, but where are we? Because it really is dehumanizing to see yourself erased constantly. And I think it's important to think about what does that actually communicate, one, to students and to Indigenous populations, to say that it's too much trouble to develop another visualization or a subset to really talk about this, and that we don't think it's important, because you communicate just as much by what you don't present as with what you do present.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we see that across multiple aspects of identity, right? It comes up with gender as well. So we may be asking across the gender spectrum, but we still only report on male and female. So, and I love the idea about thinking about levels of summaries, because that's also the way we should be doing the research, right? Is taking that big picture and then doing those deep dives within each of those groups to better understand who is there, and making sure everybody both sees themselves, but also that we know they're there and are structuring our supports with all of our students in mind. So we're going to do one last question within this larger session, and then we will have some time afterwards for folks to stick around. Dr. Stout has asked, can you tell us about talking circles and how we might use them?
So you might notice I put in the chat a link to a really great article right under Dr. Stout's original question with Amanda Taccini, Eliza Yellowbird, and Nolan Cabrera, who have an article from a few years ago on sharing circles that builds off of talking circles and the work of Joanne Archibald and story work as a methodology. And so in this, I encourage everyone to take a look. I think they provide a great example of a methodological approach, or a particular method with talking circles or sharing circles that draw on how we value stories in Indigenous communities, and how, and moving beyond talking circles, the way that they frame it as sharing circles means that if we're in relationship, and if this is a reciprocal relationship, that that we are sharing, right? So as the researchers that are in those circles, we're sharing our stories as well. So I don't know, Shelley or JD, if you have anything to add to that.
Great. Okay. Well, I would like to thank Shelley, Heather, and Jameson for sharing your work, your insights, and such valuable information in today's main session. Now I'd like to invite you to stay with me in the same room for the Meet the Expert session, where you'll have a chance to ask our presenters some additional questions or just connect. And then alternately, you can visit the Expo Hall to meet with our sponsors or take a break. So I hope everybody enjoys their afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we'll give people just a minute or two to select where they're going to land. And then for folks who are staying, please continue to type your questions into the chat or comments as well. I think we can just have a smaller, further conversation.
That's a good question about the enrollment.
Yeah, so I don't know if you all saw this question. Enrollment is down for community colleges in general. I liked the dual enrollment tip for encouraging the Indigenous community to enroll in college. Any other recruiting and application processes tips would be appreciated.
Yeah, as far as it was to encourage enrollment for the Indigenous students that we have in our community. And also, like, I think the research would show, like, a lot of Indigenous students kind of fare better in relation to how far away they are from the community or the cultural support that they receive. And so if they're not getting cultural support from an institution, but their community is available, they're more likely to persist through higher education as well as maintain those relationships that they need to have. As far as some of the practicality of it all, the dual enrollment was something that it was a collaboration, and really it was that one professor, Dr. Ellen Reek, who was able to go to her president and then go to the principal and then help bridge a lot of those relationships across. The way that they paid for the tuition was through a grant that the actual community college was able to cover for the first year. And then also because our high school is on our tribal lands, the tribal council has also committed certain amounts of money to be able to cover some of those costs as well. And so that's how they were able to get by a lot of some of the, I guess, the logistical challenges that they had. But then I think most of all, it's just everybody wanted it, so they were able to just push it through too. So I hope that helps a little bit. But.
Oh, you're muted, Devora.
Again, this word relationship, which I think is just has to be a guiding star for us. It's the relationship with the students and making sure the students have relationships with their cultural supports. I think that goes for all students, really helping them have those connections, both where they've come from and where they're trying to get to, and then our relationships as an institution within to the various communities. All right, so there is another important question. This is going to move us from kind of big picture to small picture, but the flip side to displaying small cells is protecting students' privacy. How do you deal with it? Which I think is a really good question for all of us as data folks to think about.
That's often an issue I've seen too. And for me, like, I think of it more in terms of the tribes themselves. Like if, again, collecting data by like according to tribal creation stories, that's part of the reason why I did it. Because if I was to just do it by one tribe, then the sample size would have been too small. But if I was to include two tribes, then the sample size would be large enough to be able to look at a lot of that data. And then also, like, I think even as a practice, we're removing most of the data that would be sensitive to Indigenous communities. And I think maybe that would be the advisory board too, because I wouldn't be able to speak to the exact questions that would be portrayed that may be harmful and like what we would need to protect about the students' privacy. So, and I know everyone's going to have different policies around, like, I think it's like 25 or less, you know, we're not reporting the data. And so, I mean, if that's an institutional policy you have, you know, it's kind of, I've never seen anybody able to quite overcome that. Maybe Heather or Shelly have someone, but I know for me, I've always tried to increase it, like somehow by including other tribes, or even for that matter, including local community colleges. Again, that's where the collaborations come in handy, where it's like, oh, okay, so I know this network of community colleges are in our area. For example, right now I'm collecting data within the Maricopa County Community College school districts, which there's a subset of, I think, 10 community colleges. Like I wouldn't be, actually don't quote me on that, but there's a subset of community colleges, and we're looking at Indigenous males persisting in the community colleges and following them through their matriculation into four-year institutions. And so that's one way that if we were just to look at the one community college, it would definitely be too small. But because we went across all the community colleges in that district, that's how we were able to overcome that small sample issue too.
Right. One of the things that we try to do at my institution is we aggregate Indigenous identity. So we will talk about the population, the Native Indigenous population, and include the Native Hawaiian students. We include Maori students from New Zealand, Aboriginal Indigenous students from Australia, our Indigenous Pacific Islander students. That takes a small population and starts to grow it a little bit more. Not, I can't say that it's a lot, but we also then try to capture those students that are First Nations from Canada, and even students that have tribal identities from Central and South America. And so that brings our population up a little bit. But like I said before, it takes time and it takes energy to try to gather that kind of information, because our schools and our institutions are not exactly gathering that when students are applying and when they're matriculating into the institution.
Right. And I think from the qualitative side, I've actually done archetypes or composites of some of my students. So I had a small group of 4 students I wanted to talk about. And by combining them, I was able to protect identity much better than if I had started to tell the story of a single student. So that's something to think about as well. All right. We are getting loads of questions here. Okay, so, okay, we've got a question about a college working on a land acknowledgement statement, and if you guys have any recommendations about that, or just comments about land acknowledgements in general.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat. Shelly and I just did a podcast, 2 weeks ago, for Student Affairs Now has a podcast on, and they did an episode on land acknowledgements. I think there are a lot of other resources too, and I'll try to grab some really quickly and throw in the chat. But I think a really great starting point when you're thinking about land acknowledgements is to not just stop at developing a statement for your institution. That's just step 1. In fact, that's really like -10. That's that. It's the beginning of the beginning. It's recognizing and understanding where you are and whose land you're on is an important step, and that developing that statement is an important recognition, but it's how you move beyond. So then not just having a statement, but what are the institution's commitments? So if an institution has a land acknowledgement, then what is their commitment to those local tribes or tribal nations? What is their commitment to Indigenous students? What is their commitment in relationship to land, and what is their responsibility? And as we're talking about data, then thinking about them, what are their commitments in research and in data, and how they're going to be responsible to tribal nations in that. So I think that those are really important things to think about. The starting point is understanding the history of the land you're on, how your institution came to be. Tristan Autone did a great series on land grab universities that talks about land grant institutions and understanding the history of whose land was granted. So who had to be dispossessed of land for those institutions to exist, and then what are the responsibilities? And so I think that those are great starting points.
And I think that also takes us back to the connection you guys made early on of connecting our data and our understanding to also our curriculum, right? And how we're teaching the history, which is also connected to Jean's question that a college she's worked with has offered credit for their students to participate in Canoe Journey for the last 12 plus years. Do you have other examples of how to create learning experiences that honor Indigenous student experiences?
Well, one of the things I think that is first and foremost, right? You understanding the land that you're on. Whose land was it? What's the tribal kind of culture of that land base? And what we see now in a lot of institutions that are focusing on Indigenous studies and trying to teach Indigenous issues more intimately and correctly is to start on the land. So classes will start on the land, teaching about the land, who was here, how did they live on the land, and not even being in the physical classroom until that part has been taken care of. So we start on the land, know the land, what is your responsibility as a student, and what is the responsibility of the institution for being on this land. Once you start with that foundation of having an understanding of the land as the Native people, Indigenous people, original people would have understood it, then you can move forward from there into the rest of your curriculum. But at least you've got that foundation, and it's one way that some of the Canadian institutions are starting, particularly at grad level and law school, kind of thinking about if you understand the land and the people first, then you can understand how does the curriculum that you're going through pertain to the work and what you may be doing after you've completed your degree.
I think another example of that, and thinking about learning experiences, and I love this this example here of the canoe journey, and that the credit being given for that. It really does acknowledge Indigenous knowledge systems, and is an important aspect. Building off of what Shelley's talking about, some institutions have or departments have developed tribal service learning courses that connect students back to their tribes or to a community. So they're getting credit, and also it connects to motivation for Indigenous students and desires to give back. It connects to their learning, and it connects to those partnerships and relationships with tribes.
Great example. I also know some of the community colleges in Southern Oregon work very closely with the tribes and have connected their internship and apprenticeship programs, which would be another example, which, you know, has been great for the students, but also has really helped build those relationships with the tribes. All right, we have another question that was a little earlier in the chat, going back to the talking circles. From Jack, thank you for a great session. Can talking circles and sharing circles be adapted for other populations? I see this approach as being more relational than focus group and may lead to much needed community building. Any thoughts on that?
I would say absolutely. I think if you're looking at the methodology and you're in line with the paradigms within which it's situated, then absolutely, it makes sense. This kind of decolonizing methodological approach isn't, I think, is fitting for any type of research that is looking to do things in a decolonial way. So yeah, absolutely, it is about being. It's a relational approach. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I do think there are many, many cultures that have some sort of avenue to share information, right, and to get issues and problems dealt with in a very communal type of situation. And I think that we should think about our own experiences and how we've grown up in our own communities. Are there other examples that we can think about? So I think about one of my students who is very strong in his church, and he thinks about the way he experiences church and how different aspects of church service and the community building in church relate to the work that he has to do in higher education as well.
Great. So I have one last question before we close out our session, if that's okay. I did want to ask about how we balance, especially on campuses with small numbers of Native American students, how do we balance asking for feedback, incorporating their voice, and not being a burden on the students, to make sure that we're respectful there? So do you have any strategies for that as we approach, you know, that kind of inclusive research?
I think one of the things that you always need to think about is being fair. What we find fairly often is, because you're a small population, the amount of funding you get to do events and programming that we give to small student populations is always smaller, right? Oh, well, you only get $300 because you're a smaller group. And that's something that we should always take off the table. We understand that larger populations might need a few more resources, but we should make resources equitable for students so that they feel like they're a part of it, right? That it's not that they're just being kind of singled out for being small. The other part is to continually build rapport. A lot of what Heather has talked about, right? Building community, having relationships. There should always be opportunities to sit down with Native students or small populations, because I think a lot of times they do really feel left out. They don't feel like they're part of the larger conversations or the natural community building that happens with the larger populations. We have to go out of our way to create avenues for them to have their community building, which is, you know, making more time to ourselves help them do that.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that. And sadly, we are at the end of our time. So I just wanted to thank you once again, and thank you for sticking around after to talk to our participants and answer a few more questions. We really appreciate that. And the information's been very valuable today. So if there's nothing else, I think we can probably give you back some time in your day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us and joining us today.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you saw from the chat. I think people are going to be thinking about this long and hard for the next couple of days.
Yes.
And how to put it into action. So we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good. I'm just going to stick around for another minute. I'm just mining the chat for resources and throwing them into a Word doc so I can put them in.
I didn't realize it ended at 2:40. I thought it was 2:30, so I ended us a little soon.
That's okay. So, I think the questions were done and people do need a little bit of a break before the next step. So.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate you moderating the questions. That was awesome.
Yeah, you did a great job of setting it up and they were fantastic. So
they were fantastic. So, everything about it was fantastic. So I'm so grateful to them. So,
yeah.
All right. Thanks, Devorah.
Thanks. Go take a breath.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.